Today's video is going to specifically discuss the evidence we have of evolution. Basically, how can we tell what evolved from what and that evolution actually occurred? So the most basic evidence of evolution that many people know about are fossils. Fossils are the physical evidence. Basically, you can look at remains and determine how old they are by where they are found in the Earth's crust, and also you can use radioactive dating for some of them, although a lot of them are a little too old for radioactive dating. But fossils are very basic in that they're physical remains of something. So fossils are either hard parts of the organisms, like shells or bones, that are preserved because those don't break down as easily as the softer tissue. But the softer tissue can make a fossil record when it leaves the impression. If you ever put your hand in cement before it dried and created a mold of your hand, those are still fossils that leave, it's just because it leaves a record that something was there. There are also some ancient insects that were able to be preserved in tree sap, and then that tree sap hardened and it became amber, and therefore the insects were completely preserved within those. So fossils can be a few different types, and the different types can actually tell different stories as well. So there's also evidence from ecology, and it's basically looking at how similar things are and looking at homologous structures. But if you look at, say for instance, frogs, you can look at how similar they are versus how different they are, and it'll show you different adaptations that they had to different environments, so how they evolved due to their environments, and also if they're more similar, they're generally closer related than the ones that have more variations. So the more varied you are, the longer you have been separated from that species. But if you're very, very similar, then you most likely have a very close relative. Now, homologous structures are actually very similar to the last one. They're similar features that originated in a shared ancestor. So it has to be an anatomical feature that develops. So it shows two species actually come from a very recent ancestor if you have homologous structures. So for instance, the bones in our forearm are very similar to a bird or porpoise or elephant's bone structure in their forearm or wing or flipper, and that shows that we probably came from a similar ancestor that had that same structure, and then we each species evolved slightly differently from there. Now, analogous features are actually ways to show that things are not related, but that the environment influenced that one structure. So they serve an identical purpose and look similar, but have different development and different internal anatomy. So various types of wings are very, very different, but it does show us that at some point it was very, very important to be able to fly, and that was an evolutionary advantage. So analogous structures don't show common ancestry, but still give us evidence of evolution and points in time when certain structures would be better than others. Now, vestigial structures are structures in somebody's body that seem to have no actual useful function, but they were probably useful to the ancestors. So for instance, the whales have a pelvic bone. Well, pelvic bones are to attach your legs. Whales don't have legs, but you can assume, or you can make the jump, that because they have these pelvic bones, that they once had legs, and then they lost those legs in evolutionary terms. And similar to our appendix has no use, really, but we still have it. So there are many vestigial structures, which are basically features that have no useful function, but they probably did in their ancestors, so therefore if some other organism has that structure and uses it, most likely a common relative. The next one is embryology, which is actually looking at embryos and looking at the similarities. Basically, the further along in development that you look very similar, they're more closely related, which makes sense because as we develop, that's where we develop our differences. So embryology can actually often show where certain things branch off. So if you look at a whole bunch of different embryos, like in the picture, you can see that, the rabbit and human are more similar at stage 2 than the human and the fish. So most likely we evolved away from the fish before we evolved away from the rabbit. So you can kind of create a family tree out of this. And then lastly, using macromolecules, your DNA and RNA, and looking how different the sequencing of amino acids are, and therefore the DNA and all of that. Strangely enough, the gorillas and humans only have one different amino acid in their hemoglobin. So just one different. So very, very possible we have a similar ancestor just a very long time ago. So those are all the different pieces of a puzzle to put how things evolve together, all fit into place, and it's a lot of just telling a story using various artifacts and trying to piece together the puzzle. And you can't really isolate one type of evidence. The more evidence you have, the better. And therefore, people keep on trying to find new ways and new things. There's digs and there's looking at different species all the time, and it's a very active research to determine where we all came from.